before. In fact, I just heard it yesterday when I was at lunch. Sri Lanka needs to be more like, fill in the blank, Singapore, China, Korea. We need more authoritarian structures to get everybody in line so that we can grow. I heard this all the time. We need a dictator. I've actually heard that said. We need a dictator. Keep everything in line, or this country can't grow. So I decided to check that out and actually find out about this. What are the ties, particularly most of these countries that were mentioned are East Asian. What are the actual results? Be careful with that. What does it say here in South Asia about the relationship between authoritarianism and economic growth? Now, actually, I had three hypotheses. The rates of economic growth in South Asia will be higher. In closed democracies, this is the Center for Systemic Peace. So this is kind of an important concept. This is why I did want to teach this visual. Here, we're looking at open autocracy, mixture of democracy and undemocratic elements. Here's a closed democracy. Below this little line here, we get into an authoritarian structure. It's a good methodology, it's not perfect, but it actually works for what I'm talking about here. So I predicted that closed democracies, anything on the low end, more toward the authoritarian, economic growth would be higher. Hypothesis 2, foreign direct investment would be higher. My reasons for that are, I'm thinking, much as we do, the West likes stability. So when we invest in countries, we want them to be stable. Nobody wants to invest, one reason we have here in Sri Lanka, nobody wants to invest in a country where you don't know what's going to happen to your money. So I figured that would actually be a good hypothesis too. Last one was actually a tie between shifts toward authoritarianism and economics. Namely that when the economy kind of goes on the downhill, people get tempted to become more authoritarian, more rigid, more closed. Those are the three hypotheses. I actually went through, took the data from the World Bank. I did not include Afghanistan and Bhutan. Afghanistan is basically a failed state, excuse the dead. Bhutan is so small that it essentially also does the same thing. And it has been autocratic up until it still falls as autocratic. So I left those two out. But now we start like here with Bangladesh. Bangladesh obviously started 71. What we see, what is important here that I want you to see, are the shifts. Democracy, authoritarianism, closed democracy, authoritarianism. You see this undulating pattern, this wave. Alright? We'll go back one. You'll notice that wave actually is in keeping with the economic pattern. This is GDP percentage. I actually took 5 variables. I took actually income in the top 10%, Gini coefficient, GDP spent on imports, gross national income per capita. Took these as controls to make sure that the variable that I was looking at, economic growth, was not tied to the political structure. Because if there's no growth, but everybody's getting a bigger slice of the pie, they keep covering this. Alright. Bangladesh, undulation, as you see. This is Nepal. Nepal, very interesting history as well. Also, you'll see the undulating pattern. Nepal had stayed in the authoritarian realm for a much longer time because it was a monarch, up until very recently. Actually, we see here, this coincides actually with the 2003 assassination of the royal family, or massacre. It was not politically motivated. But we see the same type of pattern. Nepal, interestingly, is a textbook case of democratization. Since 2008, it has actually gone through the process. It has gone from authoritarianism all the way through the states back up to democracy. Corresponding to that has been an increase in economic growth, an increase in foreign direct investment, and actually this has not shown. The third hypothesis is basically null. It is invalidated. There is no correlation that I found between shifts from democracy and authoritarianism and poor good economic performance. It can happen either way. You can have a record year of growth, the next year the army comes in, takes over your dictatorship. So there's absolutely no correlation. So that hypothesis will dispense with, since I'm a little pressed for time. Pakistan. Again, Pakistan, very interesting. Because it actually goes through the entire process twice. It goes from authoritarian, closed democracy, to open democracy, to democracy, to authoritarianism, and back again. It repeats the cycle. Once again, Pakistan and Bangladesh actually do validate the first two hypotheses. When they are in more authoritarian and closed regimes, they get more foreign aid and their economies improve. So all of a sudden, my hypotheses are looking very good. For Nepal, pre-2008, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Then we go here to India. India again. You actually notice it never falls out of the democratic category. The only other state that came close for a long time, Sri Lanka, did not fall out of the democratic category until later. It did have a tendency toward democratic tendencies. This coincides with 1975, what happened in India. Indian emergency. So that's when things got a little weird. What this actually shows, now, I took this, I ran this little red bit with democratic tendencies. I ran it as if it was a move toward authoritarian structures. Interestingly, much like Nepal, it actually correlates, it actually disproves all the hypotheses. As India moved lower, its foreign direct investment shrank. Its economy shrank. When it was more democratic, or I call in the paper robustly democratic, the higher up it was, the better everything was. So India is a very interesting case. What really got to me though, and this is where it comes into Sri Lanka later, this drop was rather sudden. Like I said, this was from the Indian emergency, 1975-76, it dropped. Notice though, it doesn't come back up for 20 years. This points to something very, very interesting that's going to come up when we talk about Sri Lanka. As soon as you have a small degradation in democratic institutions, it tends to stay there for a while. It takes a long time to get back. That's a little bit important later. Because Sri Lanka is the oddball. See, this is the Indian economy, or Nepal. Sri Lanka. Now you see something that's not seen in any other country. Because an interesting thing, an interesting result of this research is countries do not go downhill. Democracies become authoritarian. In almost every case, democracies drop completely to the bottom. In every single case. Then from the bottom, they move back up gradually. But when they become democracies, they hit the bottom again. This is that pattern we've seen in Pakistan, Bangladesh particularly. Up, down, up, down. No country has uniformly gone down. except Sri Lanka. Interestingly, much like India, it was very highly in the robust democracy category. 1983, I'm sure you all know what happened then. It dropped down. Once again, just like the Indian situation, once it moved into, India never dropped out of democracy, but it had autocratic tendencies. Once Sri Lanka dropped to an open autocracy, it stayed there. We had two little blips here. This is actually 2006, 2010. This is actually 2002, 2004. Two small blips where it just got right back up on the democratic line, but it's been a continuous downward trend. That is not seen anymore. Actually, once again, it finds out all the economic data actually states there is no correlation between the drop and more foreign investment or more growth. So going toward authoritarianism in the South Asian context is generally, the data says it's not a good idea. So if you think we need a dictator to run things, it's not going to work. It generally is just going to make things worse. But what became interesting in this research is a steady downward trend. What that indicates is a weakening of democratic institutions. Much like India, the strength of those institutions get really what this country should have gone through, we would expect us to be down here. The strength of the institutions actually is what kept us strong. Much as in the way that India was able to stay a democracy even through the emergency and everything else. The institutions kept the country strong. It kept it in the democratic category. What we're seeing here is a degradation of those institutions. This has some very, very bad implications. Basically what it means, as these continue to weaken, eventually what will happen will be a drop. Usually it drops from democracy, but hovering at open autocracy, it's probably not going to go down to close. It's probably going to be a quite sudden drop, if you judge by all the historical precedent. If these institutions become too degraded, too weak, what we're likely to see in the next 5-10 years, some catalyst. It could be anything. It could be ethnic riots, economic trouble, it could be anything at all. But some catalyst will eventually push. Somebody from the army will take over. Some MP, charismatic guy, will take over. And all of a sudden we're probably going to be down here. Once you get down here, you'll notice when we go back to Bangladesh, Pakistan actually had some very visionary rulers. It did have some benevolent authoritarians. Bangladesh also, especially now, really working very hard toward developing the country. But the instability means that once they get back up, they come back down. Once they come back up, they come back down. It results in this wave. That's what we have to worry about. It's the strength of the institutions, not even the quality of the leadership. You can have high quality leadership, but if your institutions are degraded, once this stops, once you drop from the democratic side into authoritarianism, it's very hard to get back. And once you get back, it's usually temporary. So what we need to do, like I said, my prediction is not very heartwarming. We're not going to like it. But unless we change things, unless we start strengthening institutions in this country, we're looking at a very rough ride. Nothing is set in stone yet, but the evidence does not bode well for us. Fortunately, there is work. People are trying to work with the Constitution, things like this now. There really does need to be a sense of urgency about this, because this trend line is very alarming. And like I said, it's very out of place in this region. Everything else will talk together.